Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a program of the Competitive Enterprise Institute focused on repeal for resilience. Today, we have a pair of powerhouse attorneys in the field of finance regulation. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to CEI Commissioner Hester Peirce. After making a mark in the private sector and senior staff roles at the U.S. Senate and at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and as a leader at the Mercatus Center located at George Mason University, Hester was sworn in at the SEC in January of 2018, and she's been a leading advocate for liberty since. In our conversations today, we'll be joined by a familiar presence to many of you and a friend to CEI, Paul Atkins. Currently, Paul leads Potomac Global Partners as chief executive after founding the firm shortly after concluding his own term as commissioner at the SEC. In addition to leading the transition teams for financial regulatory agencies, he was involved in various forums on behalf of the United States government, including the US-EU Transatlantic Forum, the World Economic Forum, and more recently, the Token Alliance, an initiative of the Digital Chamber of Commerce. We're recording the event today and we'll make it available on YouTube. If you're watching live and would like to participate, please email your question to events@cei.org. Or if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should find the Q&A function that allows you to send them in directly. So thank you both for being with CEI again. Hester, if you don't mind, I hope that you could start us off. Would you give us a brief reminder of the reach of the SEC and an update on how, if at all, the focus of your work has changed in the past 6 months in light of the extraordinary circumstances?
Sure, Kent, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the event that CEI is putting on, and so I'm really delighted to be part of this, and especially delighted to be able to be here with Paul. I have to start out with my standard disclaimer, which is that my views don't represent the views necessarily of the Securities and Exchange Commission or my fellow commissioners. So the SEC is one of two capital markets regulators at the federal level in the United States. We definitely have a plethora of financial regulators in the US, but the SEC has responsibility over the securities markets, so that's over the exchanges for options and equities, and over broker-dealers, investment advisors, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds. These are all within our purview. And so we have fairly broad reach. And the reason I was drawn to come to the SEC is that capital markets are really powerful markets in transforming people's lives. I like them personally better than the bank markets because they bring investors together with entrepreneurs and help them investors, it helps them grow their retirements, it helps them fund their children's education, and the entrepreneurs, it obviously helps them build their businesses. And it's a real partnership, and it really brings together, I think, the best of what this country has to offer in terms of transforming people's lives, taking people who have a great idea but don't have any capital and matching them with people who really want to invest their capital and building businesses that are then the backbone of the rest of the economy. So I think what happens in the financial regulatory space is so important because it sort of sets the tone for the whole rest of the economy. And so that, I think, brings us to the current situation that we're in with COVID. We are looking at trying to rebuild an economy that has been affected in a way that no one could have anticipated a year ago. And we're seeing, the statistics about the numbers of small businesses that have shut their doors permanently are heartbreaking, I think, for all of us, and the number of people who have lost their jobs. And so in trying to rebuild the economy, people will need to rely on our capital markets. So one of the things we're doing now is trying to think through how we can make sure that our capital markets, that our regulatory framework works to allow small businesses to get capital as well as larger businesses. During the last 6 months, we've been very busy with our normal work. We are able to work quite well virtually, but we've also been really sensitive to the fact that there are the entities we regulate are facing new challenges. We've seen huge trends toward work from home, obviously, as you can imagine. And so we provided relief in connection with people who have tried to do things remotely that they were previously doing in person. We've obviously had to monitor the markets closely as well. There's been a lot of volatility and a lot of volume in our markets. And we think they've held up quite well, but we've provided relief where necessary to enable people to do things that otherwise the rules would prohibit them from doing. So that's a little bit of what we've been up to. Certainly, the Chairman Clayton, keeps our agency humming right along, and we've got quite a busy regulatory agenda as well.
And just to, before I bring Paul into this conversation, just to unpack a little bit, that last comment you made about providing relief, has that come in the form of rulemaking, the discretion that you have with enforcement, in the form of guidance to firms, letting them know how they should operate? What does that actually look like?
So it's come in a couple different forms. One is guidance. So as companies are thinking through, how do I even communicate with my investors about what's going on? And it's difficult for companies because everything is so uncertain. And so the agency came out with some guidance to companies about how they should think about disclosure. It also comes in the form of providing relief from some of our rules that imagine that everything will happen in paper, and saying, you know what, there's some things that you can actually do electronically instead of in paper, or meetings that normally have to take place in person. We said, well, you're allowed to do things using some modern technology, not just in person. And then we've provided some relief in terms of temporary rules to make it easier, for example, for crowdfunding, to really provide a solution for people that will work. We've made some adjustments there on a temporary basis in the hopes that will be a way for some businesses to weather this storm. So a mix of things.
Now, Paul, you have insider knowledge, but an outsider's perspective. What have you seen different with the SEC in 2020 as they've adapted and given this guidance and as Hester was describing, made the flexibility available to market actors? How have you seen this happen?
Well, I mean, as the commissioner said, it's been really gratifying from the outside to watch how the has reacted to the epidemic and all the dislocations and the what was going on in the financial markets, because mid-March to say mid-April was kind of a scary time, and things could have gone any which way. And in a way, the SEC had been through this back in '88, and then also earlier back in 2001 with the crisis of the tax in New York City and downtown New York. So so at least in a way, I mean, it's kind of morbid, but SEC has been through that before, pulled out the book, and then went right to work despite all the other distractions and everything else. So I think really kudos to the current commission to having addressed that. And like the commissioner was saying, like, for example, one of the dispensations that the SEC gave, which is kind of shocking to me, that this statute is called the Investment Company Act of 1940, and it was passed in 1940 with a few emendations after that, but it still requires mutual fund boards to meet in person, not by telephone, but and so anyway, that was one of the ones that was temporarily, at least, the industry got a reprieve, but I think that should be like high on the list to permanently change. It's it'll probably take congressional collaboration, but the SEC has very, very broad exemptive authority and other authority under that statute. So I feel safe to say Congress would not argue with changing that one from a rulemaking perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul brings up a great point, which is that one advantage of going through something like this, and there aren't very many good things about this period of time, but it does make us kind of take a look at our rule book and say, what needs to change? And it's something that sometimes you need a little push to modernize. We definitely have taken a lesson from this event, and I think I'm looking for ways that we can make sure our rules are much more flexible to allow people to do things in ways that just make sense. Whether that's getting rid of paper requirements. Sometimes we have requirements that require people to file things in triplicate and paper, and no one's reading that. It's not going to be of any use to us. We want to get it by email as much as you want to send it by email. So little things like that, they can be little, but they can end up being a real headache for people. And so we are always looking for ways that we can try to streamline and get rid of some of those outdated rules.
I was captivated by a phrase that you used in that set of introductory remarks about you said something to the effect of making it easier for both small businesses and large businesses to adapt to these new circumstances. And there's another success just in the last few months. Maybe you could say a couple words about making these markets available to large investors and small investors. Could you talk a little bit about the accredited investing rules and why that change was important?
We recently amended the accredited investor rules, which are not my favorite set of rules. It's essentially a set of rules that says if you're rich, you're allowed to invest in the private markets where a lot of the activity actually happens. The bulk of the activity happens in the private markets. If you're not, then you have to invest. You're only allowed to invest in our public markets where the offerings are registered, and there's a whole set of disclosure requirements that go with a registered offering. And so it's understandable why this developed. The idea was that people who have more wealth or more income are maybe more sophisticated or more able to bear a loss if something goes wrong. But what we did recently is we said, wait a minute, this whole framework where we're assuming sophistication simply because of wealth or income doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I remember when I worked for Commissioner Atkins here at the SEC, he used the example of Paris Hilton. And he said, look, Paris Hilton is an accredited investor, whereas someone who's been working in the securities industry for 5 years would not be an accredited investor. And so what we did in our recent set of rule changes is we said someone who's been working in the industry, who's passed certain set of has a certain set of credentials, is able to be counted as an accredited investor. And that's important. It's a move forward. But we also opened the door to people coming in and telling us why other credentials could satisfy that accredited investor threshold. Of course, in my ideal scenario, we wouldn't have this kind of a distinction. I think people should realize that whenever they make an investment of any kind, they need to do a lot of homework. They need to ask a lot of questions. And if they're not getting the information they need to feel comfortable, they shouldn't be investing at all. That's a very important message for us to send to people all across the income spectrum. And I think sometimes when we set up a framework like this, where we've got this set of accredited investors, and then we tell everyone else, you don't have to worry, the SEC will look out for you, it actually causes people to ask fewer questions, which can be really damaging to people because unfortunately, there are always people out there who are wanting to take advantage of other people. So I'd rather have people be a bit skeptical going into the markets and just asking a lot of questions, even when they're investing in the public markets.
I'm not going to ask you to sign up for these things. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but am I hearing that things like accredited investor rules, this paternalistic attitude that we need to protect people from the risks, creates a moral hazard? And perhaps they're just not worth it?
Yeah, I really do worry about that. And again, I mean, there are terrible situations. Our enforcement calendar is just full of people who have taken advantage even of people in their family, their friends, their affinity groups, And so it really is something that people do have to be careful about before they commit their money. But I think we have to be careful not to send the message that we're putting our seal of approval on any investment. So yeah, I think I worry about the paternalism and the moral hazard.
I might even go so far as to call them never needed regulations. Paul, let me ask you, I want to turn to cryptocurrency and the regulatory structure for that. This is something that has had a lot of activity, a lot of interest. What is the statutory authority for the Securities and Exchange Commission to assert their actions in this field? What does the law say?
Well, that's pretty, I guess, a bit complicated. It really derives, in the case of crypto assets, from a Supreme Court case back, about 50 years ago or so, maybe more, called Howey, and it has to do with investment contracts, which, as defined, when securities are defined in the statute, it covers an investment contract. And so there are various elements to an investment contract, and where you're not really managing something, but then you get the fruits of the other people's labor of managing it, and you're like an investor. That's the name of investment contract. So it's kind of a facts and circumstances case very much. So there's not really any clear guidance, because it's this old Supreme Court case and its progeny, various things that have come thereafter. So it's a bit of a trap for the unwary, and back when after Bitcoin and other crypto assets started to come out, people thought, with, I think, collusion or assistance from some lawyers who were maybe not as careful as they should have been, and were trying to be rah-rah and cool, and I'll try to put out memos to generally guide people, which they didn't really do, and kind of guided them into the ditch. But they tried to sell their crypto assets in what were called initial coin offerings, and the SEC ultimately, started going after these things, and many of them were fraudulent. They were just selling, the pie in the sky or whatever type of things, and others, I think, might have been people who didn't really take the full, context of what they were doing, or realize that what they were doing was going astray of the securities laws. So we have a whole mess of those things that are still wending their way through the SEC enforcement calendar. So that's kind of the current situation, although the SEC seems to be, and we can ask the commissioner here, is not rather skeptical of cryptocurrencies, in particular Bitcoin and others, which they've pretty much acknowledged that Bitcoin is not a security, and the same with another one, Ether. And so, but there being precious few, hardly any actually, products that have been approved by the SEC with respect to these crypto assets. And if you contrast the CFTC, which is a different regulatory agency, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is more of an institutional market regulator, whereas the SEC has institutional markets, but then also a lot of retail markets where normal people, Main Street investors, are investing their money. The CFTC has been much more, I'd say, open with respect to these sorts of issues. They've approved futures in Bitcoin and maybe perhaps Ether coming forward. Ether's just been named a commodity by the CFTC. So that has changed the landscape a bit. And then recently, the acting controller of the currency, Brian Brooks, who was came to be the acting controller as he from Coinbase, which is a trading platform for crypto assets. He's just announced guidance that says that national banks can be custodians for these sorts of things. And the SEC has not address that at all. And in fact, they and this self-regulatory organization called the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority have been very reticent, let's say, to allow broker-dealers to act in that manner with respect to these sorts of assets.
So I want to hold the idea of the federal banks issuing coins and just roll back a little bit. Commissioner, you've been very clear on your views, but it seems that one important note for our audience here is the SEC has been proceeding through enforcement actions, right? Is there clear statutory authority for the SEC to regulate in this space? Or if the answer is no, is that why we're not seeing rules? We're not seeing a rulemaking process? Maybe I should just ask, could you unpack your dissents for us? There's a series of dissents here that are very exciting.
So there is authority for the SEC to be involved in this space. And I think that Paul laid it out well. When you look at the securities laws, we define what a security is, but then we have this very open end, and that includes things like stocks and bonds, things like that you would expect to be a security. But then it includes this more open-ended category called an investment contract. And as Paul said, that category has been defined by the Supreme Court case from many years ago, which over time has been used to pull all kinds of things into the security definition that one might not automatically think of as falling within that definition. So that Howey case was about orange groves, and now we look at digital assets and we look at them through that lens as well. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I'd like you to give me some money so that I can build something and you'll get a piece of the action when I build it, you don't have to do anything. I just need your money and I want to build something. That ends up looking a lot like a traditional security. And so what the SEC has been confronted with is some of these things, some of these digital assets are being marketed to people in a way that looks an awful lot like a security. And so does that mean that the securities laws should apply? And the securities laws are purposely not set in stone, but they're able to accommodate different types of things as they arise. So that's a good thing. We want our rules not to be based in years past and not be able to accommodate changes as we move along. The concern that I have, though, is that as I've been looking more at this space, I think there really is a need for us to do something specific for this space, because people are trying to build these crypto networks, and that means they need to get tokens out into the hands of lots of people. So how can you do that? You look at Bitcoin, and Bitcoin got the tokens out, got Bitcoin out into the world in one specific way that was a very organic way. And so that is one way that things can be done. But a lot of other people are taking venture capital money, they're building something, they're building a network, but then when they want to launch the network, they can't just have the venture capitalists have tokens. Other people need to have those tokens. So what do you do? And what we've come in and said is almost no matter what you do, that token distribution event, we're going to look at it as a securities offering. So you've got to come in and register that offering, or you have to rely on an exemption. Now, an exemption is tough because that means that broad distribution is difficult. If you want to register it, then that all kinds of requirements flow with that. That means that the token has to trade the way securities are allowed to trade. People who deal with tokens will then, who deal in tokens will then be broker dealers. The entities that they trade on have to be registered as exchanges or ATSs, which is sort of like an exchange light. And that makes it really complicated and really difficult for a network to grow. And so what I've said is we need to get out there and we need to create some kind of a safe harbor so that people have this time to grow their network. And then by the time they're done growing the network, there shouldn't even be a question that it's a security. It won't look like a security. In that intervening time, there might be some question about whether it's a security. So let's just give people a safe harbor, give people room to build their networks. What we've done, what my colleagues have done specifically is say, you know what, we're going to put out some guidance, which the staff did. They put out some guidance on factors people might think about to decide whether something is a security or not. But there's so many factors that people really didn't find it to be very helpful guidance. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. And then they've complemented that with a few no action letters, which is sort of like an informal kind of guidance document. Someone comes in and says, hey, this is what I'm planning to do. If I do this, will you, staff of the SEC, recommend an enforcement action against me? And in those instances, you know, that's helpful because people look to that as kind of guideposts for what the SEC will or won't bring an enforcement action on. But those instances have been cases where I wouldn't have even thought they need to come ask us for permission. I would say just it doesn't even have anything to do with the securities laws. And so then we've also brought a bunch of enforcement actions. And part of those actions are fully needed because it was people out there just basically engaged in fraud. And so if you're raising money from people and you're running off to the Caribbean with the money and leaving the people who gave it to you high and dry, I think that's a place for our securities laws. But the much more difficult cases and ones in which I've had much more trouble are the straight offering violation cases where we say you should have registered that token distribution event as a securities offering. And that's where I say we have to be really careful because we're going to squelch innovation if we force people to do things through the securities framework that don't work very well through the securities framework. So that brings me back to why I want the safe harbor. And so I've been chafing a bit at the approach that we've taken, which has been a more enforcement-centric approach than providing guidance that people so desperately want in this area. And honestly, it's really hard for a lawyer who someone comes to the lawyer and says, hey, I want to do this consistent with the law. And the lawyer says, I don't know how to help you because there's not clear guidance out there.
I want to see if I can distinguish what you described there. There's two different models that might be easily interpreted, right, by our audience, and I think one of them is quite healthy, and the other can be quite dangerous, but they sound similar, and I want to see if you can help me distinguish them. The healthy one is, as you've described, the token event. It needs a place, a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox free from all the rules, or it needs a harbor where it can develop into the thing that it will be. And that's making room for innovation. That's making room for the development of product on the market or a tool in the marketplace to help make a market. On the other hand, what I don't like so much, and I think this oftentimes gets confused with, is something of an infant industry argument, where we're just going to protect these folks because it's shiny and bright and new, or we're going to protect them because they've got better lobbyists. And it doesn't seem to me that's at all what you're talking about, but I want to be absolutely clear the difference between the two, because in each case, there is limited protection available from the regulatory apparatus and burdens for some period of time. Do I have that correct? And
I think that's a really important distinction, and I have to say I sort of came into this thinking when I joined the SEC. I thought, I mean, our rules are designed in a way that's really flexible and accommodates new things, and so why should this new thing, as you say, why should this bright shiny object get some sort of special treatment? But it isn't the thing like where we're protecting an infant industry so it can grow. It really is a case where I think there's something unique here and something that doesn't align and mesh well with the securities laws as they're written. And so that's why we need to allow And there's ambiguity, right? And so that's why we need to provide some kind of framework within which we provide some protections for people, but at the same time, we also allow the thing to develop. And to be fair, I mean, my colleagues' concerns are real. There's been a lot of money sloshing around in this space and a lot of people buying these tokens. Now, part of my response is people who buy these tokens also need to go in with their eyes wide open. And a lot of people went in and they were like, I'm going to make a lot of money really fast and I don't really care what I'm buying. I don't have that much sympathy for that kind of person, because I feel like, okay, you know, you took a risk and some of these are not going to work out. And if you wanted to do a little more homework, you might have invested or purchased, as I like to say, you might have purchased tokens in better projects. And I somewhat resent people who bought tokens and you know, did it knowing what they were doing, and then they come later and they say, oh, we want the protections of the securities laws. So everyone needs to be a little bit candid and take responsibility, but it is not an infant industry thing. I totally agree with you. I think it's really not a good idea to set up regulatory moats around either really large incumbent entities or new entities coming in. I think the best thing we can do is have a playing field where barriers to entry are low, so new competitors can come in. We're not going to protect the legacy industry. We're not going to protect the new entrants either, but we are going to provide them some sort of a mechanism so that they can comply with the law in a way that makes sense for what they're trying to do.
Okay. I want to get to a favorite topic of mine when I visit with you, Paul, which is ESG investing. But before we pick that topic up, I have a question here from Melanie that I'd just like to read off the screen for you. Commissioner Peirce, do you see the SEC considering, by order, in the near future, adding more titles or credentials to the accredited investor definition? Or is it more likely this won't happen for years? Do you think the changes went far enough?
Well, I mean, as I hope I indicated, tend to be of the mindset that we need to be really careful about sort of these paternalistic designations. You fit as accredited investor, you don't, because it's really hard for me sitting in my regulatory chair to know what your capacity as an investor is. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to know ourselves, right? And to know what our limits are, but also to know, you know, when we need to get maybe professional financial advice, which can help us make decisions too. So my view is we really ought to try to move away from these kind of arbitrary, and they're not completely arbitrary, but these distinctions of you can invest and you can invest. But we are in the world we're in, and that's a world that has accredited investor. The steps that we took, I think, as Melanie is sort of hinting at here, were not revolutionary, but they were a positive step forward. And I do hope, I mean, I'm planning to work from within the SEC to try to make sure that we really do have an open door to some of these new ideas for new credentials that might qualify people as accredited investors. So certainly I will be advocating for us to, when it makes sense, right? It's all going to be facts and circumstances, but I will be advocating for that to be a bigger tent.
Yeah, one point to throw in, and Hester, you might remember this from a dozen years ago, but at the time the commission was also, this is pre-Dodd-Frank, was considering whether or not to raise the dollar threshold for accredited investors. And one of my favorite comment letters came in, and it was this fellow who wrote in and said, "Today I can invest in a hedge fund. Tomorrow you're telling me that I may not invest in a hedge fund because you're going to raise the limit. So what's changed? So why don't you keep your hands out of my wallet and try not to tell me what to do?" So that kind of crystallizes the arbitrariness that you're talking about there. Now, of course, Congress eventually did it, in Dodd-Frank, and they boosted and changed the rules, boosted the limits and all that.
Yeah, by taking, they didn't let people count their houses anymore. And I should say that the initial limits, we've tried to go back and understand where did those you have to have $200,000 in income as an individual or $300,000 as a couple. We tried to go back and figure out, hey, what was the basis for that? And I haven't been able to figure out what the basis for the original set of numbers is. So when people say, well, you ought to adjust for inflation, my response is maybe, except that I don't know what the original basis was. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to adjust upwards. Maybe we should, or downwards, maybe we should adjust upwards to, or I'm getting myself confused, but maybe we should allow more people, right? So you might want to lower it because you don't know what the original basis was anyway.
Paul, help me set the table here. What is environmental, social, and governance investing? What is ESG all about? And why does this set of issues come up in front of regulatory commissions? You've written about this in the Wall Street Journal. You've led forums on this. Can you set the table for us?
Well, so what this comes up in the context of first, I guess, in general, I mean, there are a lot of people who are trying to have what they call impact investing. They want not just to, and these tend to be rich folks, but not always, other folks as well. But if they want to invest, they want to also do good by their investing. So they might not want to invest in what they consider a sin stock or a pollution or guns or, whatever they don't want to invest in. So that's been around for a long time. And money managers have historically also focused on how a corporation is governed. And that means, the power of the board, the power of the CEO vis-a-vis the board, how the corporation, what its internal culture is, and that sort of thing. So some of those are kind of empirically, you can focus on them from an empirical standpoint. Others are a little bit more touchy-feely. Why is the CEO flying his company airplane all the time to his beach house, and wasting corporate assets or whatever. I mean, there are all sorts of stories like that over the years, and the SEC has, kind of reacted from time to time with respect to, especially the CEO, disclosure requirements around that, thinking that, the CEO is a kind of a special person in a corporation. But then over the last several years, about 50 years, I guess, there was a court case that kind of threw open what we call shareholder proposals, from that opened the door to things that theretofore had been kept off of the proxy card, that these are issues.
Well, let me ask you to pause there for a moment, because I'm simple. I'm a simple guy, and I just like to distill these things as we move through them. It seems to me, and I want to check this with you to make sure that I'm thinking about it the proper way, that first element, investing your money based on these different criteria, is kind of like applying our foundational liberal principle of the freedom of association, applying that to the way people behave when they invest. That if I want to invest in companies or securities that prefer this behavior or that behavior, that's okay. And that's something that should be encouraged or available in the marketplace, whether it's product lines or where they operate or how they treat their employees. Is that freedom of association for my money the right way to think about that broad?
Yeah, I think you should be able to do with your money what you want. And if you want to have a particular investment strategy, God bless you, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but you should be able to do that. And then you should be able to hire a professional who is advertising like, I can help you, I can do exactly what you want, just let me know. Or here's a prepackaged fund that, it has all these different rules to it, or this is the strategy. Please put your money in. We're welcome. Welcome.
And then how do we get to the proxy statements and the shareholder action where you were just going with the conversation?
Right. So anyway, so there's one level which is kind of like the investor demand level, and how then money managers and others react to what people are looking for as to how to invest their money. money. But then you have other folks who are, let's just say, they style themselves as shareholders, but shareholders are not monolithic. One shareholder is not necessarily like the other. And there are some that are really, I'd say, you have activist shareholders. So you have some who, like in hedge funds and others, they're out to, do things. They're trying to acquire companies or to, force a company to, divest itself of, whatever, and in order to, in their view, to try to boost the level of the company and the value of its stock. So that's an activist shareholder. But then you have other activist shareholders who don't really care necessarily, in my view, about the economic interest. Their primary interest, and part of it's economic, in their view, very long term, but most of it is like a politicized kind of activism. And they have an axe to grind around some issue, and that could be partly governance, it could be an environmental issue, it could be something else, a social type of issue. So that's where that E, S, and G comes in. And Commissioner Peirce did a really wonderful job in a number of her, she always does in her speech. But with respect to this topic, Scarlet Letter was one that I remember because I was sitting on a panel that immediately followed her at AE.
Could I ask you to reprise the main argument of that speech? I concur with the gentleman across my Zoom screen here. It was a wonderful speech, but for the benefit
well, thank
of this
you.
forum,
I had to use the title, obviously. I reread that book, The Scarlet Letter, as an adult, and was really taken by how accurately it describes some of what we do in society today, which is we put labels on people and then we shun them from society based on those labels. And one of the ways that's working in the corporate world is that there are these organizations that go around and they rate companies based on their environmental, social, or governance. And now some people have added employee ahead of the environmental, social, and governance. So they look at those factors and they put a rating on those companies. And that then becomes a scarlet letter for some companies saying you can't invest in this company because it doesn't satisfy our criteria or our ESG criteria. And so it really is frustrating for a lot of companies that are trying to respond to all of these rating organizations that are asking them all kinds of questions, and they're trying to you can get in trouble with the rating organizations for not doing something that rating organization considers important, but another rating organization might have a different set of criteria, and so it's quite costly and distracting for companies, but it also may not be very helpful for investors because it's not clear exactly what the criteria are. And what I worry about ultimately is what this is doing for capital flows, because it's often very easy for us to take a label and put it on a company and say, you should avoid this company altogether, not realizing that some of the most dynamic and interesting technology may be coming out of that company. And so I think we need to be very careful. Again, as you and Paul have both said, people should be able to invest their money however they want. But I think we really need to be careful when we start to get to the point where we're making sort of broader societal determinations of where capital should flow based on these criteria that may or may not be accurate, for one, and certainly may not predict the future of where technology is going.
Well, some folks have suggested that instead of a new regulatory system for these questions, that the commission should adopt or enforce compliance with rules from a third-party body, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, modeled on FASB. What would it mean if you were to outsource standard setting like this? Or maybe to use other language, if you were to make more clear the market for these standard setting by limiting the amount of information that's flowing around?
A lot of people have come to the SEC and have said, hey, we need a consistent set of criteria, and we want you to choose what that set of criteria is and enforce it on companies and in every industry. And my response to that is, look, there's a lot of private activity going on in this space, and I think that makes, the people can do what they want to do. It does create some of those problems I just mentioned, where there are a ton of different rating organizations, and it can be really expensive and burdensome for companies and investors to try to sort through all of those. But at the same time, there's not a uniform set of metrics that applies across all companies, that applies across all industries. When I look at my role as a securities regulator, it's to get information to investors and potential investors that they need to assess the long-term financial value of a company. And so that does not mean prescriptive requirements. It means telling companies, hey, you give information that's material for people to make those determinations about the long-term financial value of your company. When we get in there and we start to say, we want to know how many liters of water you use, how are you recycling your wastewater, do you have what are your stances on these social issues? Those are not financially material across the board at every company. They may be at certain companies, but it's not like the accounting. A lot of people use the model, as you mentioned. People say, well, it's like FASB. FASB is our accounting standard setter, but it's not the same thing, because every company needs to disclose its income, and we need to understand what is driving its income. And those kinds of things. How do you recognize revenue? Those kinds of issues are common across all companies, but these ESG type questions are much more idiosyncratic.
Yeah, one thing also just to throw in with respect to the thing like SASB, it's from its very name, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. I mean, it's not about accounting. It's maybe about reporting, if even that. And nobody can really define what sustainability means either. And when you look at, its demands for disclosure, I think the Wall Street Journal did a very good job in a couple of their editorials focusing on this. Like, for example, it asks companies that are baking companies or whatever to disclose the percentage of free-range chicken eggs that they use versus, others, for example. And there are things that are completely immaterial, that it's a non-transparent way of coming up with something. And so I think it'd be a huge mistake to pick a group like that for the SEC to pin it on, whereas FASB, of course, like the commissioner said, is much more of a focused type of thing. But depending on what happens in November, as far as the election goes, the House has already passed a few bills and cleared the House Financial Services Committee that would require the SEC to go ahead and designate, SASB, for example, or look to that. Or there's another group that both happen to be formed and supported by Michael Bloomberg to a very large extent. It's not completely transparent, but another climate change task force that's kind of attached to the Basel group, the Bank for International Settlements.
One thing that's really important to remember, at least from my perspective, this is how I think about things, which is there are a lot of things that people might be interested in that are, and they look at the securities disclosure framework and they say, hey, that looks like a really convenient way for us to get some information about these companies that we want. And my pushback on that is always, we have to go back to first principles about the SEC and remember that this agency exists to get investors information that they need, not to get third parties information that they may need or may want. There are all kinds of things I'm interested in about companies, but I don't think it's the job of the SEC to get that information for me. If I want that information, I can do the research on my own. So I think that's an important piece. I think another important piece that we're seeing now is that more and more the drive is to get financial institutions to use these kinds of criteria in making decisions about where they're going to allocate capital. And that's what really worries me. I mean, as I said before, I think we have to be very careful about these kind of approaches that will cut capital off to certain kinds of companies. I think it really will end up hurting the very goals that people who are behind some of these efforts want to achieve. And I think, the goals are noble goals of trying to have a better society in which people treat each other better and live in a better environment. But those actually, I think, are best achieved by having more free capital flows.
Does it push this issue too far to say there might be a great irony in that a regulatory agency that has a lot of involvement in the nitty-gritty details of the way capital formation and capital structures and the way our companies operate, that if you hold the line, if the SEC is able to hold the line on these initiatives, you might help depoliticize an important aspect of our society. I mean, one common complaint today, and I see it every day in the newspaper somewhere, is that everything has become political, right? What clothes I pick, where I walk my dog, what kind of dog I have, where I live, how I get to work or don't get to work. All of these things have been political comments. And if the SEC were to hold the line here and say, we really only care about honest, transparent information that's material to the operation of capital flows, that would be a good thing for America.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it should not be a political question. And again, it goes back to what you both said, which is that people should be free to invest their money as they want. And that's a wonderful part of what this country is about. And if there are things that you care about more than making a lot of money, more than getting a return, then that's fine. You can figure out how to allocate your money that way. Other people will decide, you know what, I want to make as high a return as possible, but then I want to take the money that I earn and I want to give it away to groups that are doing really wonderful things for society. So there are different ways to approach things, but I agree with you that our capital markets shouldn't end up being a political space. They should end up being a space about really trying to make sure that capital is flowing to the people with the best ideas, who are able to contribute something valuable to society and build things that today, 10 years from now, we can't even imagine what we're all going to be carrying around in our pockets, right? We wouldn't have imagined that we would all have these cell phones in our pockets that can, are much more powerful than computers. So let's not limit our future by our current imaginations.
I want to see if I can squeeze one more topic in here before I turn to each of you to wrap.
Put one more plug in. Sorry, one underlying.
Sorry, dive in, Paul. Dive in.
One underlying thing, and to what the commissioner is saying there, is we have to think about the costs of all this stuff. I mean, it sounds nice. Well, why doesn't the company disclose X, Y, and Z? There's a cost to all that, because it's not just you find the number and then dump it in your registration statement. Somebody has to verify it and find it in the first place, and the lawyers have to scrutinize it and think about, well, what happens if we get sued because maybe it's not exactly, worded correctly or accurately or whatever. So there's a cost to all that, and all of these costs build up. And so today we have half the number of public companies than we had 20 years ago. The private markets, where only accredited investors or even higher institutions can invest in companies, there dwarf the public markets, or at least, if not dwarf, they're larger than the public markets now. Back when I first started, when I went to work for Richard Breeden, back in the early 90s, that was completely opposite. There was still more than half of the shareholders in the equity markets were individuals. Now that's completely reversed. It's maybe 80% institutions or something. So the things have changed, and a lot of this has to go back to the costs, because smaller companies, and Andreessen Horowitz has actually a very good, if any of your viewers are interested, they have a very good presentation where they look at how IPOs have changed over the last 30 years or so, 40 years, so that now it's really a way of exit strategy for the VCs and the private equity people, versus in the old days when Apple and Microsoft went public, it was really to try to get money to build a factory or to, advance products. So to the commissioner's point, if we don't watch out, we're killing the golden goose here that in the U.S., or the goose that laid the golden eggs here, that is such a thing that distinguished the United States capital markets from other countries.
I'm going to see if I can squeeze in a couple more questions, topics. So we'll try to do these in rapid fire, 20, 30 seconds or less. This one comes from Ron in reference to a Supreme Court decision from last year. In light of the Celia Law v. CFPB decision and the possibility of an originalist Supreme Court justice might replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, do you think the Supreme Court might allow at will, rather than for cause, removal of SEC commissioners? And do you think that would have a positive or negative effect on the SEC? Paul, I'm going to ask you to do this one in 15 or 20 seconds, and I'm going to generously let Commissioner Peirce off the hook.
Well, yeah, it's so we'll see. I mean, it's there's this argument about the unitary executive has been going on now for quite a while, and the Supreme Court has addressed it in a couple of cases here recently. But one of the seminal cases is called Humphrey Executor, going all the way back to 1930 something. But it had to do with the SEC of all agencies. So the SEC has been able to survive that, and the president can sign an executive order, and if he doesn't like the way it's going, change the chairman just by to pick another commissioner if he wants to. So there still is presidential authority there, but so we'll see. I mean, that would truly upend things, and it would be interesting to see what would happen. So,
Ron, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to tell you that I am not going to answer your question specifically, but the trend lines on independent agencies look very good, and we're going to keep pushing on those trend lines to try to accelerate them. Last topic here. I was telling you in the green room, but right before we started, how I was horrified by something that, Commissioner, you've recently spent a lot of time on and spoken about, and that's the idea of a consolidated audit trail. Could you give me in 60 or 90 seconds, what is this big brother mess that is coming our way in the form of the CAT? And what should we do about it? What should happen next?
The CAT is a new monitoring program whereby the SEC and the stock exchanges will monitor all of the trades, all of the orders in our equities and options marketplace. And that means that individual traders are being followed around in the marketplace. I think that that's really problematic. Even if you're not suspected of any wrongdoing, you'll be followed around and watched. I have argued that at a minimum, we should pull retail information out of this. There have been some steps taken to protect the information from hackers, but I'm concerned about the civil liberties aspect of it, and I think we really need to take a second look at it before it all goes fully live.
I have to tell you, I looked into this issue over the last 4 days, I guess it is, and it has eerie overtones of the social credit score type monitoring that's happening and being developed in China. And I was really, like I said, I was horrified by it. So I'm happy to see that you're paying attention to it and putting more eyes on an issue that has been moving forward year after year at the commission as a direct result of bad legislation. I want to be clear about that. Before I wrap up and share what's coming next for our audience, do either of you have a final word?
Well, I just want to thank you for the chance to be here and have had a lot of fun. So thanks for the opportunity. And I always welcome people contacting me. So don't hesitate to reach out at commissionerpeirce@sec.gov.
And I wanted to second what the commissioner said, but also wanted to give kudos to her. She was just renominated and reappointed by the president with the Senate confirmation. And so we can expect 5 more great years of a great advocate for liberty and limited government at the SEC. So I'm looking forward to all higher and better, basically. So thank you very much for your service, and we look forward
Thanks,
to
Paul.
lots to come.
Thank you both. I assure you this conversation about the SEC would have been nothing without you, because we would have had 60 minutes of me rambling on about what I don't like for government surveillance. I really appreciate what you're both doing, both leading in the private sphere and Commissioner Peirce in the agency and in the government. For everyone else, please share the YouTube link. This will be live on YouTube shortly. Next week, I hope you'll join us on the 30th. We'll be doing a special presentation of the Julian L. Simon Memorial Award to Professor Stephen Horwitz of Ball State University. We have 2 new book forums lined up for you on October the 8th and the 14th. The first of which I'll be joined with my friend from up the street, Ilya Shapiro, in his new book, Supreme Disorder. I'll be delighted to welcome back to CEI an alum of ours and a leading commentator on federal courts, Jonathan Adler from Case Western Law. And I believe, if memory serves, perhaps Commissioner Peirce, you're an alumna, is that right?
Case Western Reserve University is my undergrad, yep.
And then on the 14th, we'll have former CEA Chief Economist Casey Mulligan talking about his new book, You're Hired, Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. I think we know who he has in mind. He just completed a term as Chief Economist over at the Council of Economic Advisors. And finally, I want to remind everyone, as we close out this forum in the next 20 or 30 seconds, a survey will pop up. We take very seriously your feedback. We need that information. There's only 3 or 4 questions and then a couple open-ended boxes for your feedback. Please let us know how we're doing and what policy programs you'd like to see in the future. So with that, thank you all, especially Commissioner Peirce and Paul Atkins from Potomac Global.